The Zorth Empire had long studied Earth, observing its fractured societies, its history of war, and its relentless consumption of resources. From the safety of their advanced colonies across the galaxy, the Zorth had watched with a mix of disdain and disbelief as humanity stumbled through cycles of violence, environmental collapse, and feeble attempts at peace. To Queen Xanthalar, Earth was a world of chaos, a world that had earned its inevitable fate: extinction. For centuries, the Zorth had conquered lesser species, enslaving, absorbing, or eradicating those who stood in their way. But Earth was different. The humans' arrogance was matched only by their resilience. Every time the Zorth had planned to invade, something always interfered. The humans fought back in ways that were unpredictable, using guerrilla tactics and ingenious countermeasures. But now, Xanthalar was certain, humanity had exhausted its chances. Sitting on her throne aboard the Zorithus, her immense flagship that towered above Earth's atmosphere, Xanthalar looked down at the planet with contempt. "This is the moment," she whispered to herself, her voice a low growl. Her empire had assembled a fleet powerful enough to crush all resistance in one swift blow. The time had come to cleanse Earth, to rid the galaxy of this stain of disorder. Her decision was final. The Zorth had given humanity enough chances to prove itself, and each time they had failed. It was no longer just about conquest. It was about retribution. A lesson needed to be taught, and Xanthalar, as the Queen of the Zorth, would be the one to deliver it. "Launch the fleet," she commanded, her tone cold and unwavering. The crew of the Zorithus scrambled to comply, their movements swift and efficient. The vast ships, each one larger than the mightiest of Earth's warships, began their descent toward Earth's atmosphere. As the first wave of Zorith ships tore through the heavens, Xanthalar stood tall, her violet eyes flashing with an inner fire. She reveled in the thought of the human desperation, the final futile attempts to fight back. They would try. She knew they would. But this time, the Zorith would be unstoppable. On the ground below, in the scattered remnants of Earth's human resistance, Major Jack Harper stared up at the sky. The faint hum of a Zorith ship's engines vibrated through the air as it passed overhead, an ominous reminder of what was to come. Jack clenched his fists, his jaw set. Earth had been given its final chance. Now, humanity would either stand and fight, or fall to the might of the Zorith Empire. The fight for Earth was about to begin. And for Xanthalar, it would be her final triumph, or the beginning of an unforeseen reckoning. This establishes the emotional and narrative tone for the story, painting a picture of Xanthalar's arrogance and determination while hinting at Jack's resolve. It sets up the high-stakes conflict to come, both from the perspective of the invader and the resistance. On Earth, the war had already begun, though it was not a war most people had ever expected to fight. The invasion came not with the blare of trumpets or an army marching at the gates, but with silent ships descending from the stars, unseen and unnoticed, until it was too late. The Zorith had struck without warning, their first wave devastating. Cities crumbled beneath plasma bombardments, and humanity's military struggled to rally in the face of an enemy far more advanced. But humanity, in its chaotic brilliance, refused to surrender. The human spirit, stubborn, defiant, and untamable, found its voice in the remnants of military forces scattered across the planet. The resistance was born, not from the ranks of seasoned soldiers, but from every corner of Earth. Farmers, mechanics, engineers, and teachers, men and women who had never held a weapon in their lives, now wielding whatever they could find to fight back. Major Jack Harper, former Special Forces operative, had been one of the first to understand the scale of the threat. He had watched the rise of the Zorith Empire from the shadows, seeing the whispers of an inevitable invasion among the intelligence reports. Yet even with all his training, nothing could prepare him for the sight of the Zorith ships blotting out the sun. Still, Jack refused to believe humanity was done for. The Earth might be broken, but it wasn't defeated. From a hidden command center beneath the remains of an old military base, Jack led the resistance with a grim determination. He wasn't the best strategist or the most charismatic leader, but he understood the essence of human resilience. Jack's ragtag group of fighters didn't have the technology to win. What they had was the ability to adapt, to outthink their enemies, and, above all, the unwillingness to die on their knees. Their technologies advanced, Jack muttered, studying the data as it came in. But they can't predict us. They're too arrogant. Jack's right-hand woman, Lena Cruz, a brilliant hacker who had once worked for the government, nodded grimly. She typed furiously on a terminal, pulling up a map of the Zorth fleet's trajectory. We may be outmatched in firepower, but not in heart. We've already caused them more trouble than they expected. Across the room, a young soldier, barely out of his teens, spoke up nervously. Are we really going to win, Major? Is there any hope? Jack locked eyes with the young man, his expression unwavering. We're human. As long as we draw breath, there's always hope. He turned to Lena. Set up the next strike. Coordinate with the others. We hit them tonight. The resistance was far from an army. They were farmers and mechanics, survivors with no reason to back down. Yet they fought with the conviction that no matter the odds, no matter the power of the Zorth, Earth would never bow. This section emphasizes the raw determination and ingenuity of the human resistance, highlighting Jack's leadership and their ability to fight an enemy far more powerful. It sets the stage for a deeper, personal struggle as the story progresses, with humanity's survival hinging not on strength, but on their adaptability and spirit. The full force of the Zorth fleet descended on Earth's capital, a city that had once stood as the symbol of human resilience and unity. Now, it was the target of a ruthless alien invasion, a shining jewel poised to be obliterated by overwhelming force. The Zorth had deployed their advanced weapons, kinetic bombardments that rained down from above, plasma strikes that turned city blocks to ash, and legions of ground troops sent to secure key installations. The resistance had been preparing for this, but no amount of planning could have prepared them for the sheer scale of the destruction. As buildings crumbled and fires raged across the skyline, Major Jack Harper watched the chaos unfold from the underground command center, his jaw clenched in frustration. He had known this day was coming, but the sight of his home, the heart of Earth's fragile unity, falling apart before his eyes still struck a deep, painful chord. Focus, Major, Lena Cruz snapped, her fingers flying across the keyboard. We're still in this. The capital's fallen, but we can't let them have it. Not without a fight. Jack's hands gripped the edge of the table, his mind racing. The Zorth aren't just here for the capital. They want to break our spirit. If they take this city, they'll have a stranglehold on Earth. We need to hit them before they can secure their hold. He turned to the map of the city, lines of resistance forces scattered throughout, and a large red X marking the Zorth's ground command post, right in the heart of the capital. It would be suicide to strike there, but it was the only way to keep the enemy from consolidating power. We have one shot at this, Jack said, his voice low but steady. I'm going in. We take out their command center, and we send a message. This isn't over. Lena hesitated but nodded. I'll get the coordinates to your team. But Major, this is going to be bad. The Zorth will have it heavily guarded. Jack looked at her for a moment, knowing the risks. Every single person in his team had already fought beyond the limits of endurance, and yet they were willing to do it again. Humanity's strength wasn't in its numbers, it was in its will to survive. I know, he said quietly, but we got something they'll never have. Heart. Lena didn't argue. She tapped a few keys and handed him a data pad with the coordinates of the command post. Good luck, Jack. If you're going to do this, you'll need all of it. As Jack left the command center, he joined his squad, his closest comrades in this desperate fight. The squad was a mix of old soldiers and young recruits, all of them marked by the brutality of the war. They exchanged determined glances as they gathered their weapons. No words were needed. They were ready. They had to be. Outside, the capital was burning, But Major Jack Harper was about to remind the Zorith of one simple truth. Humanity had only just begun to fight. This section ramps up the action and tension, showing the stark contrast between the overwhelming power of the Zorith and the relentless spirit of the human resistance. Jack's leadership and the Resistance's will to survive are tested as they make a daring, high-risk move to strike back at the heart of the invasion. The stage is set for a brutal mission, with everything on the line. The sound of blaster fire and explosions echoed through the narrow metallic corridors of the Zorithus, but Major Jack Harper had no time to take cover. His heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted through the wreckage of the flagship, the taste of smoke and scorched air stinging his senses. His squad had been split up in the chaos of the ambush, but Jack had a singular focus now: find the Zorith Queen. He'd known from the moment he'd laid eyes on her, cold and regal, that there was no mercy in her heart. Xanthalar was ruthless, a conqueror who'd overseen the destruction of entire worlds. Humanity was nothing more than an obstacle to her, a species too primitive to deserve survival. But in that moment, Jack had made a decision he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would save her. Rounding a corner, Jack skidded to a halt as he found her, a bloody, crumpled figure lying in the wreckage. Her armor, ornate and formidable, was torn open, revealing her alien form beneath, her skin now a shade of purple, almost translucent in places. Xanthalar was unconscious, her breaths shallow, her blood mixing with the debris. She was dying. For a heartbeat, Jack stood frozen, staring at the creature who had been responsible for so much suffering. Every instinct in him screamed to leave her, to let the Zorith Queen perish and wipe his hands of the entire conflict. But something deeper held him in place, something that defied the hatred and the logic of survival. He dropped to his knees beside her, scanning the gaping wound in her side. "Damn it," he muttered. Her species biology was unlike anything he'd ever encountered, and the sight of her injuries made his mind spin. He wasn't a medic. He didn't have the training to patch up an alien. But he knew one thing: if he didn't do something, she would die. With shaky hands, Jack pulled off his own gear, tearing strips from his jacket to make a crude bandage. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers brushing against the slick, cool surface of her skin. He could feel her pulse, weak but steady. He worked quickly, wrapping her wound as best he could, his focus entirely on the task. She stirred, groaning weakly, and her violet eyes fluttered open, locking onto him with a gaze full of hatred. "You." Her voice was raspy, barely audible. "You, human." Jack met her glare without flinching, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, I'm human. And I just saved your life. So you're welcome." Xanthalar snarled weakly, but the venom in her voice was clouded by pain. "Why? Why would you?" "I don't know," Jack replied, exhaling sharply. "But I did. Now we need to get out of here." He lifted her, his arms around her as he carried her away from the battlefield. She was heavy, and her resistance was growing weaker with every step. She didn't trust him. She probably never would. But for now, she was alive. And that, Jack realized, was all that mattered. This section shifts the focus from the external battle to the internal conflict Jack faces in saving Xanthalar. It highlights his internal struggle between the hatred for the alien invaders and the fundamental human instinct to help, even those who seem undeserving. The decision to save her marks a turning point, both for Jack and the story, setting up an unlikely dynamic between the two characters as they continue their journey. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, fragile and ready to snap at any moment. Jack kept his back to Xanthalar, scanning the darkened hallway of the Zorithus for any sign of movement. His mind raced, strategizing escape routes, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the alien queen. He hadn't expected her to be so quiet, so resigned. There was a cold fury still simmering beneath the surface, but her pride had been chipped away by the defeat, by the near-fatal blow she'd suffered. For a fleeting moment, Jack wondered if she was truly defeated or just biding her time, waiting for an opportunity to turn on him when he least expected it. He glanced back over his shoulder. Xanthalar's eyes were fixed on him, unwavering and sharp despite the blood loss. "You should have let me die," she said quietly, her voice raspy but steady. "You could have saved your people. Why waste time on me?" Jack snorted. "You think letting you die would have changed anything? You think Earth would have won the war by just getting rid of you?" Her lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Yes, I do. Without me, the Joreth will lose their drive. They will falter. We are the will behind the Empire, the reason they conquer. Without us, they are nothing." Jack stared at her, incredulous. "That's your reason for all this? You really think the Joreth will just fall apart without you? I've seen what your Empire does. You destroy everything in your path. Earth doesn't need you gone to win. It needs your Empire to lose." Xanthalar's eyes flickered with a flash of something. Was it regret? Before she turned her head to the side, looking away from him. "You misunderstand. It is not the destruction I am proud of. It is the control. The strength to command a galaxy, to shape it in our image. That is the true power." Jack shook his head, a bitter chuckle escaping his lips. "Control? You call that control? Destroying worlds, subjugating entire species. That's just fear. You're terrified of losing power." Her gaze snapped back to him, sharp as a blade. "You dare call me fearful?" "Yeah, I do," Jack said evenly, his tone challenging but not hostile. "If you were so sure of your power, you wouldn't have to stomp on everything weaker than you. But you're not confident, are you? You know deep down that this kind of empire isn't sustainable. Not for the long run." Xanthalar's gaze hardened, her jaw tightening, but she didn't speak. Jack could see the wheels turning in her mind, the seeds of doubt taking root. For all her arrogance, for all her proclamations of superiority, something about her demeanor had shifted. Whether she was willing to admit it or not, Jack's words had struck a chord. "We're not the same," she finally muttered, her voice barely audible. "You and I." "No," Jack said with a soft sigh. "We're not. But that doesn't mean we can't help each other. And right now, we need each other to survive." Xanthalar was silent for a long moment, her gaze never leaving his. The tension between them, thick as smoke, was palpable. Yet, somewhere between the veiled contempt and the grudging respect, an uneasy understanding had begun to form. This continuation deepens the psychological and emotional conflict between Jack and Xanthalar. While their alliance is far from friendly, there's a moment of clarity for both of them. Jack calls out Xanthalar's fears, challenging her self-perception, and in turn, she is forced to confront the cracks in her own empire. This sets up the growing complexity of their relationship, one based on necessity, but with hints of transformation on the horizon. The Jorethis was a fortress, its vast corridors stretching into the heart of the ship like the veins of a monstrous beast. Every footstep Jack took echoed in the silence, the weight of their precarious situation pressing down on him. He was running out of time. The ship's power core had been compromised during the battle, and reports were coming in that the Joreth fleet was preparing to abandon ship and regroup. If they didn't make it out soon, Jack and Xanthalar would be trapped in the wreckage. Xanthalar, though still weak, had regained enough strength to walk on her own, albeit with difficulty. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if she were fighting every step. Jack had made a makeshift sling for her, but now that the initial shock of her injuries had worn off, she seemed more determined to move under her own power, despite the obvious pain. The uneasy silence between them stretched for miles. Jack knew she wasn't thrilled to be relying on him, but the stubbornness of the Queen hadn't quite extinguished. They were both fighting against the inevitable. "I should have killed you when I had the chance," Xanthalar murmured suddenly, her voice low and venomous. Her gaze was distant, unfocused, but Jack could sense the simmering resentment in her words. Jack didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He'd heard that sentiment from her before, and he'd heard it from countless others. Instead, he simply adjusted his grip on his weapon and focused on the task at hand, finding the escape pod. They turned a corner, and Jack's pulse quickened as he saw the glint of light ahead. It was a docking bay. At the far end, he spotted a small shuttle, a single escape pod, waiting for them. The door was open, and the light inside beckoned like a promise. "That's our way out," Jack said, his voice low but urgent. "We're almost there." Xanthiler's eyes flickered toward the pod, her expression unreadable. She hesitated for just a moment, and then nodded. The act of survival was ingrained in her, despite her disdain for humanity. She was no fool. The alternative to escaping with Jack was death. Her pride, at least for now, could wait. As they hurried toward the pod, Jack's mind raced. He knew that once they boarded the shuttle, it wouldn't be a simple matter of flying away into the stars. There were still dozens of Joreth ships in orbit, and they would be looking for any survivors, especially the Queen. Jack didn't know what he was going to do once they were off the ship, but he had a gut feeling that their fight was far from over. Xanthiler, sensing the tension in the air, finally broke the silence. "You think you can keep me safe, human?" she asked, her voice dripping with irony. "You can't. You won't." Jack didn't look at her as he climbed into the pod, but his words came out steady. "I'm not trying to keep you safe. I'm trying to get us both out of here. The rest is up to you." Xanthiler glared at him, but her hands gripped the edge of the door, the barest flicker of something, perhaps respect, perhaps need, passing through her cold gaze. Then, without another word, she stepped inside. The hatch slammed shut, sealing them in. The countdown began. This section builds up the tension of their escape, emphasizing the growing sense of urgency as time runs out for both Jack and Xanthiler. The moments of dialogue reveal the underlying friction between them, but also hint at the reluctant cooperation that is slowly forming. As they make their way to safety, the next phase of their journey looms large, with new dangers ahead and no clear answers. The escape pod shuddered as the hatch sealed with a heavy thud, the low hum of its engines the only sound in the small, confined space. Jack sat at the controls, fingers dancing over the holographic console, inputting coordinates with practiced precision. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Once they left the Zorithus, there would be no going back. They would be fugitives, human and alien, two former enemies forced into an alliance, both hunted by the very empire Xanthiler had once ruled. Behind him, Xanthiler remained eerily quiet. She was seated against the wall, her face pale but composed. Jack couldn't help but glance at her occasionally, noting the faint twitch of her lips or the subtle tension in her posture. She hadn't spoken since they boarded the pod, and Jack couldn't decide if that was a good thing or not. But then, given the circumstances, silence was probably preferable. As the pod shot away from the Zorithus, Jack engaged the afterburners, propelling them into open space. He punched in a vector toward the edge of the solar system, heading toward the asteroid belt where they could lay low and plan their next move. "The fleet will be looking for us," Jack said, breaking the silence, his voice steady. "We won't be safe for long. So we need to decide. What now?" Xanthiler didn't immediately respond. Jack heard a soft sound, a hiss of air as she exhaled, almost as if she were weighing her options. Finally, she spoke, her voice heavy with frustration. "You ask me what now? You think I know?" Her words were sharp, but they lacked the venom they once carried. "My empire is shattered. I am a fugitive, the very thing I once commanded others to hunt down. And now I am forced to rely on you." Jack's grip tightened on the control panel, but he kept his tone neutral. "I didn't ask you to rely on me, but we're in this together now. We survive, or we die." She glared at him, her violet eyes flashing with a mixture of defiance and reluctant acknowledgement. "I never needed anyone to survive. My people were meant to rule this galaxy. And look where that got you." Jack shot back, unable to resist. "You lost your fleet. You lost your throne. And now," Here we are, surviving because we have no other choice. Xanthiler didn't respond for a long moment. Jack thought she might say something cutting, but instead, her eyes softened just a little. She shifted in her seat and muttered something low, almost too quiet to hear. "You're right," she said, almost imperceptibly. "I've lost everything." Jack paused, taken aback by the vulnerability in her voice. Before he could respond, the pod jolted, a violent lurch throwing both of them against the restraints. Alarms blared as a warning message flashed on the screen. "Incoming fire. Jorath interceptor detected." "Great," Jack muttered, slamming his fist against the console. "They found us." Without hesitation, he pulled the pod into a sharp evasive maneuver, racing toward the asteroid belt. Their brief moment of reluctant understanding was shattered in an instant. The fight for survival was far from over. This section raises the stakes and tension as Jack and Xanthiler face the consequences of their escape. The fragility of their uneasy alliance is reflected in their interactions, while the sudden appearance of a Jorath interceptor reminds them both that their survival is far from guaranteed. The mix of vulnerability and pride in Xanthiler's character becomes more pronounced, setting the stage for future growth and more conflict. The pod lurched again, a violent shake that rattled the small vessel to its core. Jack cursed under his breath as he fought to keep the ship steady, his fingers dancing across the controls with practiced precision. The Jorath interceptor was relentless, its weapon systems flashing ominously on the radar. The gap between them was closing fast, and Jack knew they had only seconds to react before they were caught in the crossfire. "Hold on," he barked over his shoulder to Xanthiler, who had finally regained some strength and was gripping the edge of her seat, her alien features contorted in concentration. Despite her arrogance, Jack could see the fear flickering in her eyes. The Great Queen was no longer in control, and that reality, one that had shattered her identity, was written across her face. Xanthiler's voice came through gritted teeth, her words as cold as ever. "Do not tell me to hold on, human. I know how to fight." Jack didn't respond. There was no time for back and forth, only action. The interceptor's proximity warning blared as it locked onto their pod, its plasma cannons charging for a final strike. With no way to outrun it in open space, Jack made a snap decision. He angled the pod toward the asteroid belt, a dense cluster of rocks and debris that could provide cover. It was their only chance. "Brace for impact," Jack shouted as he executed a sharp roll, threading the pod between two massive asteroids. The narrow passage was a perfect place for evasion, but it also risked them being shredded if they didn't time it right. The Jorath interceptor followed, its lasers cutting through space, narrowly missing the pod. Jack's pulse raced as he weaved through the floating debris, the ship's systems screaming in protest. But they were making it, just barely. The interceptor couldn't match their speed in the asteroid field, its larger frame unable to navigate the tight turns. Then, an explosion rocked the pod, throwing Jack forward against his harness. Damn it! He quickly checked the damage reports. Nothing critical, but they were losing power. They couldn't keep dodging forever. Xanthiler's voice broke through the chaos, colder now than it had been in days. "You think this is how it ends? You're wrong." Jack glanced back, surprised. Xanthiler wasn't looking at him, but at the readout of the Jorath ship on the scanner. The hatred was still there in her voice, but now there was something else, a sense of purpose. "You said you wanted to survive," she continued, her eyes flickering with a dangerous fire. "Then let me help you. I will destroy them. We are not dying today." Before Jack could react, she was already moving, pulling herself to the rear of the pod where the secondary weapons were stored. Jack's breath caught in his throat. "Wait." Xanthiler, no. But it was too late. The Jorath Queen, wounded and broken, had found her fight again. And with a chilling sense of finality, she opened fire. The first blast hit the interceptor's engine, sending it spiraling into a nearby asteroid. The second and third hits followed, tearing apart the Shoreth ship in a burst of fire and twisted metal. The threat was neutralized. Xanthiler sank back into her seat, breathing heavily, her expression unreadable. Jack's hands still gripped the controls, his heart hammering in his chest. They had survived, this time. But as he glanced over at the Queen, still holding her pride despite everything, he knew that this alliance, fragile, brutal, and born of necessity, wasn't over. It had only just begun. Brings the story to a tense and explosive climax. Jack and Xanthiler are forced into their last stand, with Jack making the choice to rely on their only possible escape, the asteroid field. The climax is defined by Xanthiler's unexpected, but fierce, return to power as she takes control of the pod's weaponry, ensuring their survival. The ending leaves open the possibility for further challenges and growth, setting the stage for the uncertain future of their uneasy alliance.